The Baton Lectureship was inaugurated in 1988 to commemorate the work of Professor Roland Bainton. Roland came to Yale as a student in 1914, joined the faculty in 1921, and retired in 1962, although he remained active in the community until his death in 1984. The lectureship focuses on two foci of Professor Bainton's life and work: church history and the church's witness to peace and justice. Past Bainton lecturers include Anthea Butler, Eamon Duffy, John O'Malley, Andrew Walls, Eric Middlefort, Barbara Newman, and Frank Turner. To introduce tonight's lecturer, I'd like to call on my colleague Bruce Gordon. Bruce.
Thank you very much, Dean Ettridge, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Roland Bainton was a person of wit, humor, and compassion. Among many other things, he's fondly remembered for having performed the singular feat of bicycling up the hill to the divinity school so slowly that he appeared to defy science by not toppling over. He would sketch his students in seminars. He was a storyteller and a passionate teacher, a brilliant scholar whose books on the Reformation continue to be read. His purview was broad, and as a master of elegant, lucid prose, he knew how to take his learning to a wider public, to a readership beyond the university campus. This evening we come together for the Bainton Lecture, and I cannot think of a more fitting speaker for this occasion than Dermot McCulloch, Professor of the History of the Church at Oxford University, a scholar, teacher, writer, television presenter, and mentor. As the title of his lecture suggests, he is a historian of the Reformation, but with his latest books and television programs, he has reached millions around the globe. Born in Kent, England, Professor McCulloch grew up in Suffolk before heading to Cambridge, where he was an undergraduate and an organ scholar. After further studies, he returned to Cambridge to commence doctoral work under the great Sir Geoffrey Elton, doyen of Tudor studies. Following Cambridge, he taught at church history at Wellesley College and in the Department of Theology at the University of Bristol. From 1995, he's been a Fellow of St. Cross College in Oxford, and from 1997, Professor of the History of the Church in that prestigious university. His books are extraordinary achievements. His Suffolk and the Tudors examined the relationship between the counties and the central government and was the winner of the Royal Historical Society's Whitfield Prize. The later Reformation in England, 1990, discusses the ideas that shaped the English Reformation and surveys the ways in which the English reacted to it. His subtle and learned and moving portrait of Thomas Cranmer, simply entitled Thomas Cranmer, A Life, published by Yale University Press, set the standard for early modern biographies. It received the James Tate Black Memorial Prize in 1996 and the Whitbread Biography Prize. Tudor Church Militant was his examination of the undercurrents of the reign of Edward VI. This was followed in 2003 by the Magisterial Reformation, Europe's House Divided, 1490-1700, a tour de force that reflected Dr. McCulloch's mastery of the field and his broad comparative analysis. It received the 2004 National Book Critics Circle Award and the British Academy Book Prize. Dr. McCulloch has recently expanded his range a little, and in 2009 came to A History of Christianity, the first 3,000 years. This time, the award came in the form of the Cundall Prize from McGill University, and a jury member from the New Yorker wrote, at a time when quarrels between believers and non-believers, new atheists and old faithfuls, dominate so much of our public discourse, McCulloch has given us the one thing we need most, not polemic, but history. History high, wide, and lucid, and given the enormity of his task, often winningly light of touch. Together with the book came a 6-part television series entitled A History of Christianity. Books and prizes are not the whole story. To know Dermot McCulloch is to know a person committed to the discipline of history and the mentoring of young scholars. He has been unflagging in training doctoral students, in working on behalf of professional bodies, reading manuscripts and offering generous comments, and in editing the Journal of Ecclesiastical History. I don't know how he is at riding a bicycle, but in our speaker this evening, we have the best of expansive, humane, and wide-ranging scholarship. It is my pleasure to invite Professor Dermot McCulloch, Fellow of the British Academy, to deliver this year's Baton Lecture on What If the Arians Had Won? A Reformation historian reconsiders the medieval Western Church.
Thanks, Bruce, for that very generous introduction. It's a delight to be with you and a great privilege to lecture under the aegis of Roland Bainton, one of the greatest historians. His book on Luther is still probably one of the finest treatments of Luther in the field. So it seemed to me a good idea to step back from the Reformation in giving this lecture to you. And that's why I've chosen the theme I have. I've spent most of my career trying to understand the 16th century. And when at the beginning of the 2000s I took on a task rivaling the conceit of Icarus and writing the history of all 16th century Europe, I gave it the title House Divided. And my publisher, realizing that this might puzzle some potential purchasers and therefore lessen our sales, made me turn this into the subtitle for the wider title, Reformation, Europe's House Divided. It has a simpler title over here, so you won't buy it under that title, but you can still buy it. The point, however, remains. House divided. If you study the 16th century, you are inevitably present at something like the aftermath of a particularly disastrous car crash. All around are debris, half-demolished structures, people figuring out how to make sense of lives that have suddenly been transformed. And it's taken me several decades to lift my eyes off that present emergency, to consider how things were before that great cataclysm, which was no less a cataclysm for being something which I feel happy to celebrate and to cherish the good results which flowed from it. So what do I find as an historian of the Reformation looking back to its past? The most noticeable, remarkable thing about Western Europe in what we call the Middle Ages is its cultural and religious unity, united by a common alignment with the Pope in Rome and a common language for worship and scholarship, Latin. A monk in Anglo-Saxon England invented a word for this in Anglo-Saxon when he came to translate a Latin word in the 5th century history written by a Spanish priest, Orosius. When our anonymous Anglo-Saxon wrote his translation of Orosius, perhaps at the court of King Alfred in Winchester, at Wessex, there was not yet a place called England. But his fertile mind could encompass what he now called Christendom. And it was in fact to be Christendom which gave rise to England, but that's another story. Now, Western Europeans who know anything about their history tend to take this united medieval phase of it for granted, in the way that when we're growing up, we take for granted the environment around us as the norm by which everything else is judged. But this obscures the fact that it is unique in human history for a region to be so dominated by a single form of monotheism and its accompanying culture for a 1,000-year period. Only Saudi Arabia comes close to it, and for a much shorter period than that, and I challenge you to name another example. Islam has the concept of ummah, but this has nothing of the unity possessed by Western medieval Christendom. In other words, the dominance of the church, which looked to the Bishop of Rome, was a freak in human experience, albeit a freak with profound consequences for the present day. Its breakup in the 16th century was a return to the normality of human history, rather than some unexpected or even undesirable accident. And it was only when I began filming a pretty large-scale history of Christianity for the BBC, and we started travelling on location, that this really struck home to me. What I described in my latest book as the unpredictable rise of Rome was the result of happenstance, accident, and things could have been very different. And one place in particular focused my attention on the happenstance of medieval Western Christendom. It was the city of Ravenna in northeast Italy, which was the last capital of the dwindling Western Empire in the 5th century until the last little token emperor was unceremoniously retired in 476 CE. And then, from 493, Ravenna was the capital of one of the many rulers who replaced imperial Roman rule, Theodoric the Ostrogoth. Now, Theodoric was an exceptional man. He established his rule in Ravenna, supposedly as a subordinate of the Byzantine emperor, but in reality as an independent monarch, one of such talent and capacity that even later Byzantine chroniclers had to give him grudging credit. Nevertheless, they would have thought of him as a barbarian, and so often we still unthinkingly call such people who occupied the space of the former Western Empire. And it's fatally easy to see such barbarian kings of that era only through the lenses provided by contemporary chroniclers, who were virtually all clerics, and clerics of what became the Western Latin Church, which likes to call itself Catholic. Rulers like Theodoric were not Catholics, but the great majority of them were, in fact, Christians. It was just that they were not Catholic Christians. They were Arians, Christians who'd refused to sign up to the deal steamrolled through the Council of Nicaea by the Emperor Constantine the Great in 325 CE. Arian religion among the Goths was the product of an audacious and far-sighted missionary move westwards from what is now Turkey. During the 4th century, this mission was spearheaded by agents of one of the great politician bishops of this first phase of Christian power in the empire, Eusebius, Bishop of Nicomedia. Now, Eusebius of Nicomedia has had a bad reputation in the history books over the centuries because of that phenomenon, which I've already noted, that history books were written by Catholic clergy. But Eusebius proved that he was not merely a politician with short-term goals when he encouraged a mission to the Goths, led by one of their own called Ulfila, and Ulfila translated the Bible into their native language and his native language. He actually deliberately omitted to translate the Book of Kings on the grounds that their content was too warlike and might give the Goths ideas. This was not a stratagem crowned with success. The Goths remained enthusiastic for war as the Roman Empire was defined to its cost. And they came to see their theological difference from the imperial church as an expression of their racial and cultural difference. When they came to occupy large sections of the former Western Empire, they kept their faith intact and unsullied by Nicene Christianity for a long time. And so Theodoric entered the conquered imperial capital of Ravenna as an Arian Christian. His adoption of the sophisticated culture that he found is witnessed by a handful of superb buildings which survive from his rule in Ravenna to this day. And it was one of those buildings which my film crew and I were now going to visit. It was a freezing January day, but I was well wrapped up. And the habitual waiting around that you do when film crews are messing around gave me plenty of time to contemplate the meaning of this extraordinary building. The church which we were filming is what is now called Sant Apollinare Nuovo, St. Apollinaris the New Church, in allusion to an older church with the same dedication in the port town of Classis, just outside Ravenna. St. Apollinaris was the alleged first bishop of the city, but when St. Apollinare Nuovo was built by Theodoric in the early 500s, it had a different dedication. It was the Church of the Redeemer, and it was Theodoric's own palace chapel. So, we were standing in the Arian Chapel Royal. This is probably the grandest church building ever built in Italy for a non-Catholic version of the Christian faith. Certainly the only one still standing, which is anything on a grand scale at all. And what is immediately visually striking when you walk in from its cloister and look eastwards towards the altar is that this is a church of classic Christian basilican form. Clearly, it was not commissioned for leaders who were disrespectful of established Christian tradition, or who regarded their faith as anything other than central to that Christian tradition. And it reveals some interestingly individual features which survive from its original decoration. Some of the mosaics in Sant'Apollinare are contemporary with the first building as it was put up in the early 6th century. Two sequences depicting the court of Theodoric and notables at Classis both now make no visual sense, as the figures have been rather ineptly replaced by abstract mosaic designs. These heroic portrayals of a heretical monarch and his retinue could not be allowed a place of honour in what became a Catholic building. Yet one sequence of original mosaics survives. Friezes intact because they are safely remote from the viewer at the very highest level of the walls above the clerestory. And this set of mosaics spans the whole length of the church at the very highest levels. And it seems to emphasize the Arian view of the nature of Christ. It tells stories of Jesus Christ's life on earth. On the north side of the church, Jesus is the miracle worker, teller of parables, shown as a young, beardless man. While on the south side, he suffers his passion and goes through his resurrection, portrayed older and bearded. So the Redeemer lives his life, grows and matures as a truly human being, who suffers as a truly human being, and yet is resurrected for our sakes. This was the message which the Arians felt was endangered by the outcome of the Council of Nicaea, against whose Nicene statement Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia had campaigned all his life. Theodoric thus proclaimed the Arian faith to the world with all the resources of Christian art and architecture, even though he also tolerated Catholic Christians in his city and in his civil service, and let them build their own magnificent churches. And despite bombing hits in both world wars, Sant'Apollinare and the other Ostrogothic survivals in Ravenna are among the few European witnesses to Arian culture, when virtually everything else produced by the Arians has been deliberately erased from the record by the medieval Latin Church of the West. That was a profoundly important visual symbol for me. It suggested an alternative future for the Western world, which would not necessarily have looked to Rome, with all that that meant in terms of the link to the imperial past. Well, we travelled on through Europe in our filmmaking, and I continued to brood on this theme. How had Rome ultimately beaten off the Arian threat to its central place in Western Christianity, when every other centralizing Roman institution had faded away? Well, I began to glimpse an answer when we arrived at a slightly nondescript small town in southern France, at the heart of which was a charming and now fully functioning Benedictine monastery. The place is called Ligugé. Now here in Ligugé, probably in the year 361, there gathered the Christian West's first known monastic community at what seems to have been an ancient local cultic site in a marshy valley around a charismatic ex-soldier called Martin. And you can climb into a crypt below the much later medieval church to see archaeological traces of the community buildings of Martin's monastery. Not long afterwards, Martin was one of the first ascetics anywhere in the church to be chosen as a bishop in the Gaulish city far to the north called Tours. So now, Martin of Tours was not merely a charismatic holy man, but a political leader in the Western church. And in his public career, Martin retained enough of his soldierliness to emerge as a notably aggressive campaigner for the elimination of traditional religion, which was then still strong in rural Gaul. There is a building underlying the foundations of his monastery at Ligugé. In other words, under the crypt are the monastic buildings, and under that there is something else. And probably it can be interpreted as a pre-Christian temple. And what's significant about it is that it has been systematically dismantled. In other words, it looks as if Martin trashed it. Martin's ministry played out against formidable opposition in the late 4th century. It was clearly dramatic. And it marked the beginning of Western Christianity's move out of the cities and the wealthy Roman villas into the countryside, to seize on ordinary people and soak the Western Roman Empire in Christian practice. The outlines of Martin's campaigns are now luridly obscured by a biography created by his fervent admirer, Sulpicius Severus. Sulpicius had not known Martin particularly well, but he built on his fond memories of their occasional meetings to produce a picture of a man with sensational powers. Martin, for instance, had on one occasion undermined a tree sacred to old gods, then stood in the path of its fall, but forced it to fall elsewhere by making the sign of the cross. The audience loved it. And as a result, Sulpicius said with satisfaction, "You may be sure salvation came to that region." Perhaps a less miraculous explanation for such triumphs in the face of conflict is that Martin evidently had the knack of fascinating young aristocrats from important Gallic Roman families, which resulted in him drawing them into the religious life as monks. Gathering powerful friends cannot have done Martin's campaigns any harm. Sulpicius proudly pointed out that many of these young men went on to take new public responsibilities as bishops. And that was the beginning of a very significant trend in the Catholic Church, which laid the foundations for medieval Western Christendom. Frequently, bishops of the Catholic Church were the only form of Latin authority left, since the imperial civil service had collapsed. And one suspects that capable and energetic men who would previously have entered imperial service, or who had indeed started out as officials in imperial service, now entered the church as the main career option left to them, when in the surviving Eastern Roman Empire they still had the option of being imperial bureaucrats. The Western Church has remained notable for the presence within its clerical ranks of a great many who are interested in clear rules and tidy filing systems. Western canon law was one of the West's intellectual achievements long before its systematization in the 12th century. And Western theology has been characterized by a tidy-mindedness which reflects the bureaucratic precision of the Latin language, not always to the benefit of its spirituality. So Martin had a lasting effect at all levels of Western society. Now, many of those who'd known Bishop Martin rather better than Sulpicius Severus were infuriated by Sulpicius's exuberant stories, but their opinions were drowned out in the course of time by the wild popularity of this biography of Martin. For the first time, Sulpicius Severus gave the West a major wonder-working saint to equal any of the great names of the East. And moreover, Martin was a monk to equal any of the great monks of the East. Another boost to the self-confidence of the Western Church. One of the stories told by Sulpicius gave Western Christianity one of its most frequently used technical terms. Martin was said to have torn his military cloak in half to clothe a poor man who was later revealed to him in a dream as Christ himself. Now, this cut down, torn in half, little cloak, capella in Latin, later became one of the most prized possessions of the rulers who succeeded Roman governors in Gaul. And the series of small churches or temporary structures which sheltered this much venerated relic were named after it, capellae. And thus the West gained its name for any private church of a monarch, and later just for any small church, a chapel. That's a mark of Martin's central place in Western Christianity. Now, the effect of Martin's reputation in the West is, to my mind, much neglected in our understanding of why medieval Europe became what it was. Crucially, Martin's spiritual power was associated with those in the church who honoured the greatest shrine in the West, that of St. Peter in Rome. So Martin was the apostle of the Church of Rome, and therefore the champion against the Arians. A startling witness to that I found as I stood contemplating the other mosaics in the January chill of that same church in Ravenna, Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, which had started life, you will remember, as the Arian Chapel Royal. Now, in the 550s, the Byzantine emperor seized Ravenna back from the Ostrogoths to make it Roman once more, and once more also a city of purely Nicene faith. Purely Nicene faith. And the Catholic Archbishop of Ravenna celebrated the Byzantine emperor's confiscation of the Arian Chapel Royal and converted it to a place of Catholic worship. And the heart of this ceremony was his rededication of the building elsewhere. But what saint would the Catholic Archbishop of Ravenna choose for the Church of the Redeemer? Not some Eastern Byzantine saintly champion against Arianism, even though that would have pleased the army commanders from Constantinople and their imperial master, and even though there were plenty of such saints to choose from. No, he turned to a saint equally geographically remote from Ravenna, and with a shrine far to the west, and not to the east. Martin of Tours, the Gaulish bishop and monk, now dead and a cult figure for more than a century. It was a significant little gesture to demonstrate that the Western Church was not now going to be digested into Eastern Christian practice, even after such a significant victory for Byzantine military power and Catholic Christianity as the reoccupation of Ravenna. The West had its own holy champions. And in the nave wall mosaics of that church in Ravenna, Martin of Tours still proudly leads the procession of male saints towards the Saviour, even now, though the church has been inconsiderately rededicated to the local hero St. Apollinaris. So I was looking at the witness to a very significant moment of self-assertion in the Western Church. And that's not all. Bishop Martin's work excited many others who sought to preach their faith in the West, not just where Roman city life either was decaying, but also in those places where Roman city life had never existed at all. It can be no coincidence that now in the 5th and 6th centuries, a number of individuals began taking missionary initiatives beyond Gaul and even beyond the empire. This was usually without any obvious encouragement from the bishop in Rome. Pope Gregory I's personal launch of a mission to the English in 597 is quite untypical of how it happened. A common thread was that these missionaries had spent time in Gaul or even in Rome, and so they were Nicenes and not Arians for the first time. Previously it had been the Arians doing missionary work, not Nicenes. To take some examples to my own country, north of the furthest imperial frontiers in the provinces of Britannia, an ascetic called Ninian, whose name I bear, established a mission around 400 in what is now southwestern Scotland. Reputedly, Ninian built a church in stone, such a rare sight in the area that it was called the White House Candida Casa. And this site at what is now called Whithorn is still marked by the rather stolid ruins of a medieval cathedral, and it was probably the first Christian outpost north of Hadrian's Wall. Ninian, or one of his early successors, dedicated this church in honour of Martin, the Gaulish bishop, who'd only very recently died at the time of Ninian. And some of you may have been to Canterbury in Kent, in England, and if so, you may have found your way, I hope you did, to a little church, a very little church, which was already there when the monk Augustine arrived from Rome in 597, and which is still there. The same fabric is there. And either before Augustine got there, or as a result of his arrival, it was dedicated to Martin of Tours. By then, Martin had clearly become a crucial saint for one branch of the barbarians who were establishing their successor kingdoms in the West. And it might be argued that his memory was decisive in winning this particular people to the Roman obedience away from Arianism. They were called the Franks. And it was the Frankish royal family who sent the King of Kent a royal bride who worshipped as a Catholic Christian in that very church of St. Martin in Canterbury. Clovis had become the king of the Franks in 481, and he extended his family's power all through the former provinces of Gaul. Henceforth it was known as Francia, more or less now the area represented by France. Like other Germanic leaders, Clovis dallied with Arian Christianity, and members of his family certainly chose Arianism. However, he married a Catholic wife, and he developed a devotion to the saint of the Catholic Church who, like himself, had been a military man, Martin of Tours. The point was that the God of Martin won Clovis his victories, just as that same God had favoured Constantine 2 centuries before for his victories. The fascination of Rome and its local saintly champion tilted Clovis's beliefs towards his wife's faith rather than the Arianism of his relatives. And much of what we know about King Clovis comes from Bishop Gregory, a great Gallo-Roman aristocrat. And Gregory was, guess what, Bishop of Tours. And thus Gregory was Martin's successor, as well as the saint's devout partisan and biographer. And Gregory tells us that in around 500, the Byzantine emperor Anastasius granted Clovis the ancient imperial title of consul, an honour which Clovis lavishly celebrated in Martin's and Gregory's city of Tours. And this was a decade or two before that other cultivated barbarian monarch, Theodoric the Ostrogoth, built his chapel royal in Ravenna. And what a different future each event represented. The grant of a consular title to Clovis could not be a real assertion of Byzantine power, and Clovis would not have wanted it to be. But it represented the Byzantine emperor's eagerness for alliance with an unexpected Catholic Christian ally against the Arians, against the rulers in the West. Consular dignity was a potent link between an old world and a new. And at the heart of that Catholic victory, as we've seen, was the dead Saint Bishop Martin of Tours, now trophy saint for Clovis's Merovingian dynasty. And Clovis was the first in a succession of monarchs who proudly bore the title of Most Christian King in the realm which became France. And over a period of 1,300 years after Clovis's conversion, 18 monarchs of France were christened with his name, which in its French mutation of a Latin Ludovicus became Louis. Now, the Latin Church could look to a powerful military patron in the West, who was neither an Eastern emperor of dubious orthodoxy or an heretical Arian like Theodoric. It was nearly a century before Arianism finally lost its chance of shaping the future of Europe. Around 589, the Visigothic rulers of Spain withdrew their loyalty from their ancestral Arianism and embraced the Catholic faith, which most of their Latin Christian subjects had defiantly retained. And note that date, 589, how close this is to that unique act of Pope Gregory the Great in launching a mission to the former Britannia under Augustine of Canterbury, 597. Pope Gregory would have been very conscious that in the same decade, the Visigoths in Spain had tipped the balance against the Arians, and his mission was addressed to the Frankish queen consort in Canterbury, Bertha. All this, then, came out of my wanderings with a film crew around Europe. My travels had alerted me, jigsaw-like, to the importance of the 590s in creating medieval Europe as it actually was. The way in which the history of Catholic Christianity has been told obscures just what a near miss Arian Christianity proved in the West. No wonder the name of Clovis has remained so celebrated, and no wonder that half a century after that extraordinary consular ceremony in Tours in 561, the Bishop of Ravenna looked west to find a saint for the rededication of the Arian Chapel Royal. And there's a strange little tailpiece to this story of the monk Bishop of Tours, which brings him into the period I know best and Roland Bainton knew best. More than a millennium later, in 1483, a little boy was born on St. Martin's Day in North Germany. So he was given the name of the much-loved saint, and his surname was Luther. And he also left something of a mark on Western Christianity. In fact, the second Martin destroyed the Catholic unity which the first Martin had done so much to create. Now let's begin some counterfactuality. If in the early 500s the balance of preferences among barbarian monarchs had been swayed by the Spanish Visigoths or Theodoric rather than by Clovis of the Franks, European Christianity would have remained a decentralized Arianism, rather than looking to a bishop in Rome who came to have aspirations for a universal monarchy. And we know the outcome. The Pope's alliance with the Frankish monarchy blossomed into an even closer alliance with the successors to the Merovingian Franks, the dynasty including Charlemagne, who founded an institution which came to call itself the Holy Roman Empire. These emperors helped to preserve the role of the popes in the 9th century against the temporal and spiritual authorities of Byzantium, at a time when the papacy emphatically did not show much signs that it was worth preserving. But the Carolingians did it. Despite that, 11th century popes came to chafe in their alliance with the Western emperors. Culminating in the reign of Gregory VII in the later 11th century, these popes drew on all their steady build-up of rhetoric over the previous 5 centuries to create a vision of a priestly substitute for Christ, whose aim was to rule the entire world in the interests of Christ. This has been the noblest as well as the most dangerous vision of the Roman papacy. And it has to be said that later bishops of Rome have never explicitly abandoned it, as many a Protestant has pointed out since the 16th century. Perhaps we might ask Pope Benedict to consider some definite statement about the matter amid his various other ecumenical concerns. The consequences of the shift in fortunes from Arians to Catholics are incalculable, partly because of the great success of Western Catholic Christians in obliterating traces of their rivals. I think that the one thing one might confidently say is that the 1,000 years of religious centralization would not have happened. Would the future of Western Christianity have been as a series of royal churches, each looking to a dynasty for its centerpiece, and with no overarching sense of what later popes in very recent years have been fond of calling a magisterium? That would make them much more like the churches which go to make up what calls itself orthodoxy, for they would have probably ended up with a set of distinct liturgical languages, not a single unifying Latin. In other words, just like orthodoxy has got such a set of languages. In the absence of much definite information about Western Arian Christianity, we can at least try a few what-ifs. I will try that for you. I wonder if things had gone the other way, whether the resulting federation of Arian churches would have been quite so willing to create institutions of persecution to enforce a single faith, as the Western Church came to be. The Western Church has a much worse track record of intolerance and persecution than the Orthodox and Oriental churches. There were very few burnings for heresy in the Byzantine Empire, and they ceased soon after the West resumed burnings in the 11th century, although in later centuries burnings resumed in Orthodox Muscovy, apparently first thanks to a prompting from envoys of the Holy Roman Emperor in the 1490s. In fact, there was a long tradition in the Orthodox Church of leading churchmen criticizing burnings at the stake, which has little or no parallel in medieval Western Christendom. Partly, the Orthodox, of course, have been saved from themselves in the matter of persecution. Once the Orthodox churches of the East and the Balkans were in the hands of the Ottoman Turks, persecuting Christian heretics was no longer a practical proposition for Orthodox Christians. Yet it's noticeable that in Orthodox lands, even when the Orthodox authorities had power, Jews did generally far better than they did in the medieval Latin West, at least up to the 19th century. Remember that it was that most loyal daughter of the Pope, the Kingdom of England, which first had the idea of expelling the entire Jewish population in 1290, having already previously invented the blood libel. It's an English invention. Protestants and Catholics alike live with that legacy, because both are the heirs of the Western Church of the Latin Rite. Well, that might be termed the negative side of the Catholic victory in the West. Let's balance that with a consideration which springs out of what one might identify as the main reason for Catholic success against the Arians. The bishops of Rome made a great success out of being Roman. We've seen what imperial resonances meant for Clovis, and even more so was it for the Emperor Charlemagne, who bathed nude as Romans should, and issued at one stage a symbolic coinage which was an uncannily faithful reproduction of Roman imperial coinage. When Anglo-Saxons in the 7th century converted to Christianity, archaeologists digging them up have noticed that their elite dress became much more uniform, far less regional than it had been before. They were dressing like the Catholic elite of Francia, who in turn were imitating what elite subjects of the Byzantine emperor were wearing. Above all, a fascination for Rome meant turning to Latin. The Irish and the Anglo-Saxons, neither of whom had been ruled by a Roman emperor, took to this alien language with enthusiasm. All the more remarkable because they would have to learn it from scratch with virtually no clues from their own language. And in the process, they made themselves two of the best educated peoples in Europe, speaking some of the best Latin and producing some of the greatest scholars. And the result is that we know quite a lot about them. Contrast them with the Picts of Scotland, who clearly had bitter memories of their clashes with Roman legions and seem generally to have despised Latin. And what do we know about the Picts? Their very language has virtually vanished from the record. And the speaking of writing of Latin preserved much more than the books of the Church. Because the Western Church used Latin for its own purposes, it took an interest, complicated and sometimes grudging interest, but an interest in the vast range of Latin literature composed before Christianity had achieved its established status. I wonder whether Arian Christians would have felt the same way. Might they have preserved a few translations of Latin literature in successor languages and not much else? We can't know. But what does seem reasonably certain is that Arian Christianity did not embrace the monastic life in either East or West. Maybe it would have done in the end, but it did not. And if it did not, then it would not have experienced, Arians would not have experienced the extraordinary central place in culture which monasteries came to play in early medieval Europe. And there is a fascinating question attached to this, a fascinating question about early medieval Europe, which is very difficult to answer. How did libraries survive the slow disintegration of the Western Empire? The few institutional collections which might have imitated the Library of Alexandria faded because they had no civic or governmental culture to sustain them. After all, look what happened to the Library of Alexandria. It faded away. And who else had libraries? The occupants of villas scattered across the Western Empire, and we know how villa culture decayed away. So where would those tattered, damp-ridden collections of scrolls end up? You probably know the terrible image at the end of Umberto Eco's great novel, The Name of the Rose, where the young hero returns late in life to the burned-out monastery which he had fled in the hour of its destruction. And he climbs up through the ruins of the library to find one rotting bookshelf intact. Lying on it are its manuscripts, now reduced to incoherent fragments, from which he can only construct one paragraph of beautiful but unconnected phrases. Our classical heritage was nearly like that. But remember that the plot in The Name of the Rose hangs on an unwarranted assumption of ours about the Middle Ages. We tend to think that it was obvious that monks should have libraries. But that was not at all obvious in the 5th or 6th centuries. There is very little in early monastic rules about scholarship. Why should there be? An interest in literature could be considered a dangerous involvement in the world, as of course Umberto Eco knew. Remember his terrifying blind monk, Venerable Jorge, who hides and eventually eats the manuscript of Aristotle's work on comedy in order to prevent it polluting the world. And in fact, one might attribute monastic interest in learning solely to the personal selfishness of a 4th century Westerner. The Latin Bible translator, former papal secretary and wannabe saint, Jerome. Jerome failed in his first bid for sainthood when he found that the fearsomely demanding life of monks in the Syrian desert was too much for him. So when he tried again as a monk in a much less demanding monastery in Bethlehem, he produced an interesting and important spin on the scholarly task which he enjoyed so much. Traditionally, scholarship had been an occupation associated with elite wealth. And even in the case of this monk in Bethlehem, it was backed up with an expensive infrastructure of assistants and secretaries. But Jerome did a wonderful piece of image presentation on his scholarship. Study and writing, he insisted, were as demanding, difficult, and as heroically self-denying as any physical extravagance of a Syrian monk, or even the drudgery of manual labor and craft, which were the daily occupation of monastic communities in Egypt. And people bought this new idea. Now, if Jerome had not been so successful in his campaign for sainthood, and in persuading future writers that it was just as much of a self-sacrifice for a scholar to sit reading a book as it was for St. Simeon to sit on the top of a stone pillar in Syria, it might have been far more difficult for countless later monks in Western Europe to justify the hours that they spent reading and enjoying ancient texts and copying them out for the benefit of posterity. Ultimately, the beneficiary was Western civilization, Protestant as well as Catholic. And then add Jerome the role of that usurper of Merovingian Christianity in Gaul, the self-proclaimed Emperor Charlemagne. Charlemagne mightily encouraged monastic life, and one of the reasons he did so was to multiply the number of books in his world. Thus, he brought to an end the long hemorrhage of written information from the classical world, which had resulted from texts dying as a single manuscript witness gradually decayed. He encouraged a massive program of copying manuscripts into books, his scribes developing from earlier Merovingian experiments a special script for fast writing and easy reading, Carolingian minuscule. It's the script you read when you pick up a book today. Virtually nothing of the classical literature or early Christian writing that had survived into the West appears to have been lost since the time of Charlemagne. In that 9th century burst of copying, we kept our literature, and it was through the monasteries which he founded. In virtually every case, the earliest surviving manuscript is from that period. This information explosion was the basis of an attempt to remodel and instruct society on Christian lines. The emperor's advisors drew up systems of law to regulate all society by what they saw as the commandments of God. Among Charlemagne's favourite reading was The City of God by the greatest Latin-speaking theologian in the history of the Church, Augustine of Hippo. The West never forgot the centrality of Augustine thereafter, whereas Eastern Christianity ignored him. It was that same Augustine who was to inspire Martin Luther. And so we speak of a Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries. Then we speak of a 12th century Renaissance, before the third great Renaissance of the 14th to 16th centuries. Each was involved in a major reconfiguration of the Western Church in 3 very different ways, the last of which, the Reformation, has been my lifelong study. Each of these Renaissances represented a new obsession with the learning of pre-Christian imperial Rome and the classical Greece, which had fascinated the Romans so much. And let's contrast that with the curious fate of pre-Christian learning in the empire which was the actual successor of Rome, Constantinople. On the eve of the West's 12th century Renaissance, Constantinople witnessed a sequence of trials for heresy, involving leading scholars of literature and theology. The first, Mcculloch, in the end, it escaped serious consequences, but his student, John the Italian, was not so fortunate. He was silenced and ended his days obscurely in a monastery. The same thing happened to John's student, the theologian Eusebius, Metropolitan Bishop of Nicaea, finally dismissed in disgrace. Now, all these clashes had political dimensions, but there were more long-term issues at stake behind them. All these three scholars were keenly interested in using classical texts, particularly Plato and Aristotle, to illuminate Christianity. And that aroused a great question. How far could pre-Christian philosophy be of use to Christians? Interest in Plato and Aristotle did not die away in Constantinople after this, but as far as mainstream theology was concerned, a great contrast developed with the Latin West. On the eve of Western Europe's rediscovery of Aristotle in the wonderfully argumentative movement called scholasticism, the Byzantine authorities were turning away from the same intellectual resources. Now that mood intensified in orthodoxy. Contemplation became privileged over curiosity. And when there were signs of a Renaissance in Byzantium, parallel to the Renaissance in 14th century Italy, they were snuffed out by the final ruin of the Byzantine Empire in 1453. And so it was left to the West to carry the inheritance of classical culture. And orthodoxy devoted itself in its dire crisis to a heroic effort of preserving itself exactly as it was. Not a mood in orthodoxy before that. Such a tangled, complicated story. And we've so little idea what the might have beens might have been. But I leave you with a thought that the Reformation might be seen as the last revenge of the Arians on Western Latin Christianity. Now that thought will infuriate many modern Protestants, and it would certainly have infuriated 16th century Protestants, who were as good as Roman Catholics at burning real Arians and Unitarians in the 16th century. But whatever else the Protestant Reformation did, it succeeded in breaking up the unified culture of the West once more and radically challenging the centralizing impulse of the See of Rome in Western Christianity. Whether or not the success of that challenge is permanent, we shall see. Remember the wise words of Zhou Enlai, the great historical survivor, long-term first Prime Minister of Communist China. When asked what he thought were the chief effects of the French Revolution, he replied that it was too early to say. How much more is that true of the triumph of the Bishop of Rome in medieval Europe?